Hi, I'm Dan King, and I will be your guide through this video. Just a quick note about the format of the video. We will be covering how to fill out the easy application for PPP forgiveness. We have a separate video on filling out the full form. If you know that you have to use that form, you can stop now and go find the other video. I'll caution you that the easy form is much easier. If you can use it, you should use it. The rules on PPP forgiveness were greatly simplified when Congress passed the Flexibility Act. Even with that, some of the rules are dense and not very easy to follow. In this video, we will tell you the basics of how to fill out the forms without going down the rabbit hole of providing a full explanation. Most of you won't want that much information. If you do, from time to time in this video, we will have geek notes. If you want to spend some time with these, pause the video and read to your heart's content. We will take you part of the way down the rabbit hole, but I guarantee you that we will not take you all the way to the bottom of it. Now on to the form. The easy form is exactly that. It's pretty easy. There are two parts of the application: the 3-page form itself and the 4 pages of instructions. There is always a possibility that this form may change, so make sure you have the most current one. We are using the most current form available on today's date, which is August 6. There's also reason to believe that this form will be turned into an online portal, and you will input the information directly into that portal. That portal does not exist as of today, so we cannot tell you too much about it. You must be qualified to use the easy form. The rules for determining if you are qualified can be found on page 1 of the instructions. To qualify, there are basically 3 sets of questions at the top of the page 1. You must be able to check the box by one of these questions in order to use the easy form. Let's look at these questions one at a time. The first box asks if you are self-employed, an independent contractor, or a sole proprietor with no employees. If you are, you will check this box and you can use the easy form. That one's easy enough. The second box is a 2-part question, and you must be able to answer each part in the affirmative. In the first part, you must certify that you did not reduce any individual employee's salary or hourly wages by more than 25%. The periods to make this calculation are specified in the question. Keep in mind that you can reduce an hourly wage employee's hours by more than 25%. You can just not reduce their hourly wage by more than 25%. In the same vein, you can also reduce a salaried employee's hours worked by more than 25%. You just cannot reduce their effective annual salary by more than 25%. Note that if the employee had an annualized rate of pay in excess of $100,000, you do not have to make this calculation. There are some interesting methods on how to determine if an employee has an annualized rate of pay in excess of $100,000, and they may not be what you think. If you want to know more, see the first geek note, which will be coming up shortly. In the second part of this 2-part question, you must certify that you do not reduce the number of employees or the average paid hours of employees between January 1st, 2020 and the end of the covered period. So essentially, the business had no reduction in its overall employment during the specified period. Please note that the test here is based on the average paid hours of all employees. You are allowed to reduce any individual employee's hours as long as the average paid hours for all employees did not decline. There are also 2 notable exceptions which allow a business to reduce its overall employment and still answer in the affirmative. First, if the business was unable to hire similarly qualified employees, and second, if the business offered to restore an employee's hours and the employee refused the offer. If one of these is the reason for the reduction, then the business can ignore that reduction. Basically, you can just act as if the employee was still there and working their regular hours. As stated, this must be true for the period between January 1st, 2020 and the end of the covered period. What does the end of the covered period mean? It can be one of four things. It can be the end of 8 weeks from receipt of the loan. It can be the day upon which the business files for forgiveness. It can be the end of 24 weeks from receipt of the loan, but in no event can it be later than December 31st, 2020. Basically, if the business files for forgiveness after the end of 8 weeks, the end of the covered period will either be the date upon which the business files for forgiveness, the end of 24 weeks, or December 31st, 2020, whichever is shorter. This all gets complicated and somewhat convoluted. So if you want to go down the rabbit hole, pause this video and read the first geek note, which we'll only leave up for a few moments. Let's move to the third two-part question. The first part of this question is the same as the first part of the second question discussed a few moments ago. The second part of the question says that if the business was unable to operate at the same level of business activity due to compliance with requirements or guidance issued by HHS, the CDC, or OSHA, the business does not have to make a calculation for changes in full-time equivalent employees. Note that this is a yes or no question. The business does not have to link a 50% FTE reduction to a 50% business reduction. If they were not able to operate at the same level, they are exempt from making this calculation. Please know that you do not have to have a direct order from HHS, the CDC, or OSHA to use this clause. Additional guidance from the SBA says that an order from state or local governments is sufficient, since it is based in part from guidance from one of the federal agencies. Well, we've made it through the questions. And if you have successfully checked one of these boxes, you can use this form. So let's start looking at it. On page 1 of the application, the first sections are straightforward and will come directly from your loan documentation. Let's focus on employees at the time of loan application. Although it is not critical for the easy application, remember that when the SBA says employees, they mean full-time equivalent, FTEs. There are two accepted ways for calculating FTEs. If you are using the easy form, it really won't matter which one you use. So I suggest using the easier method, which is that everyone who works 40 hours or more a week counts as a 1 FTE. Everyone who works less than 40 hours per week counts as a 0.5 FTE. Employees at the time of the application means for the pay period including the date you applied on. If you think you may have used a different number when you applied for the PPP, or the EIDL loan for that matter, don't worry. It doesn't matter anymore. Just calculate the correct number now and put it in the form. Time for another geek note about the definition of an FTE and the two ways that you can calculate them. Employees at time of the forgiveness application. This is the same calculation just now done at the time you are submitting the application. The time period for the calculation is the pay period that includes the date upon which you are submitting the application. That could be a week, 2 weeks, half a month, whatever your normal pay period is. If you received an idle advance, you will enter that dollar amount here. The covered period. We just went over that a few minutes ago, so if you need to review, please rewind this video. The alternative covered period. Most of us won't have one, but if you choose to start your covered period so that it aligned with your pay periods, you will use that here. Remember, you can only use an alternative pay period if you pay biweekly or more frequently. Businesses who pay less frequently, like twice a month, cannot use an alternative period. Did you get more than $2 million? If so, you will check this box and you should make sure that you have a good accountant, because it is highly likely that you will be audited. Why? That belongs in a geek note. I will just add that any business that is not sure if the PPP was a necessity for them should probably read this geek note, even if you received less than $2 million. Well, we finally arrived at the actual calculations. There are only 8 lines in the form, and we will look at them one by one. Line 1, payroll cost. This is where you will enter the total payroll cost that the business paid or incurred during the covered period or alternative covered period if you are using one. The cash compensation portion is pretty straightforward for most employees. It includes salaries, wages, tips, commissions, paid leave, unless that leave is related to the Families First Coronavirus Act. If it is, see the next geek note, and allowances for dismissal and separation. Remember, you can include cash compensation that is paid during the covered period and cash compensation that is incurred during the covered period. If you aren't clear on this, see the next geek note. Okay, now here are the employees for whom cash compensation is a little less straightforward. First, employees making more than $100,000 per year are capped at $100,000 per year. If you have an 8-week covered period, the most that this can amount to is $15,385, which is $100,000 divided by 52 weeks in a year times 8 weeks in a year. If you use the full 24-week covered period, you can count $46,154 as the maximum for an employee. If you use a number of weeks less than 24 weeks, the maximum will be $1,923 times the number of weeks in your covered period. You can pay your employees more, you just cannot count it towards the forgiveness amount. The other type of employee for whom cash compensation is limited is the owner employee. Owner employees are limited to the lesser of 2.5 months of their 2019 reported income from the business, or 2.5 months at a rate of $100,000, which comes to $20,833. Why? That sounds like a geek question to me. So please read the next note. Finally, payroll costs also include benefits paid or incurred during the covered period, as well as state and local income taxes paid. There is a list of what types of benefits can be included in the instructions, and there are limits on what can be used for the owner employee or self-employee. See the instructions. I think a geek note has been promised and is overdue, so here it is. Business mortgage interest payments on line 2. This seems pretty straightforward. 1 point. A business can include interest payments paid and incurred during the covered period, but cannot include prepaid interest payments. These are not allowed to count towards forgiveness. Do notice that the mortgage has to have been in place on or before February 15th, 2020. Line 3. Business rent or lease payments. Again, you can include paid and incurred expenses. Unlike mortgage interest, there is no limitation on prepayments as long as they were paid during the covered period. Why is this true? I'll leave that for the next geek note. Line 4. Business utility payments. Again, you can include both paid and incurred. In theory, you could prepay utilities, but I don't think many of us will do that for this expense. In line 5, we add up lines 1 through 4. In line 6, we enter the amount of our PPP loan. In line 7, we divide our payroll cost on line 1 by 0.6 or 60%. This is a threshold. We must spend at least 60% of the amount forgiven on payroll. Remember, it used to be 75%, but now it is 60%. Forgiveness amount, line 8. We enter the smallest of lines 5, 6, or 7. As long as we spent all of the PPP or more on allowed expenses and spend at least 60% of it on payroll cost, this will be line 6, the PPP loan amount. In theory, we are done, except for assembling documentation and signing all the certifications. But it seems that there's something missing. Weren't we told that we would not be forgiven the amount of any idle advance that we received? And didn't we enter that number above in this form? Yes, that is true, and it is still what all of the documentation says. So either they will change this form before they start accepting applications, or more likely, they will address this liability somewhere further along in the process. What happens to the idle advance amount? Time for one final geek note. The math is done. All the business needs to do now is attest to the certifications, provide the optional demographic information, and assemble the necessary supporting documents. The required documentation is laid out pretty clearly on page 4 of the instructions, so I won't review them here. Just remember that the more carefully you assemble this documentation, the more easily your forgiveness process will go when you submit your application to the bank. It seems like this took a little while to go through, and this is the easy form, so be glad that you can use it. For those who cannot use this form, we have a second video available on the full forgiveness form. Thanks, everybody, and good luck.